Welcome to the Federal Mobility Policy Update for October 6th, 2020. This week, our guest is Leeann Hall. She's with the Alliance for a Just Society. We'll learn about how AJS is working with grassroots groups, along with labor and transit agencies, to fight for and prioritize transit. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. I'm Daryl Young with the Summit Foundation. This week, we're going to be covering what's not happening in the Beltway and what's happening outside the Beltway. With me to wrap this up and to summarize what's going on is my colleague Martha Rosowski with Further Strategies. She also leads a funder collaborative on mobility. Martha, what is or is not happening in the Beltway?
So as far as I can tell, it's total chaos in DC right now. The White House, I wish everyone well there and, speedy return to health, but I think there's not a lot of legislating going on right now. The House, the latest we heard is that there is funding for transit within the House HEROES Act. The likelihood of that moving forward is very slim, and prognostications seem to be changing on a daily basis. So rather than tell you something today that is old news tomorrow, we decided that we'd take a look instead at an area that we're really pretty excited about, which is the field work that's happening, of building the voices of transit supporters, the people who ride transit, the labor unions, and really everyone who lives in cities who depend on transit, whether they ride the bus themselves or whether they're just trying to live in a city where mobility works, where people can get around, where we're not deadlocked on congestion, where we're headed toward a sustainable future. So we're really excited about the work of the Alliance for a Just Society that is leading some of the field work to connect local advocate voices to their members of Congress.
So the word is that there is gridlock within the Beltway. Outside the Beltway, frontline communities, advocacy groups locally are starting to build the consensus and the work necessary to prioritize transit, to protect transit. And earlier, we interviewed Leeann Hall, who's with the Alliance for Just Society, on exactly what is happening out in the field. Let's go to that interview. All right. So with all that's happening, we've invited Leeann Hall, who is the executive director of the Alliance for a Just Society, who has been organizing communities to inform elected officials as to what is the actual need on the ground during this crisis. Martha.
Yeah, really happy to be here. These briefings have generally focused on the federal level, what's going on in Congress, but we realize that especially around transit and mobility, we don't have like really highly paid lobbyists in the back rooms of Congress, DC restaurants passing money around. Like, our power comes from people on the ground, people who ride transit, people who use transit, people who work in transit, people who want to ride bikes, people who, are thinking about mobility in the community. So it's really important to connect the dots between federal level work to actual transit riders. And Leeann is, I think, doing a really brilliant job in that space on pretty short notice. Transit crisis, coronavirus, what are we going to do to keep transit alive? And really delighted to just touch base with Leeann and learn a little bit about the work and how she's operating and what she's thinking, what she sees going forward. So Leeann, welcome.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Daryl. Great to be here.
So what are the three things you most want funders to know? And I'll pitch in that just this idea of, field work, of connecting the dots between what's happening in Congress to the places where our power lies, which is in the voices of people talking to their members of Congress, may not be something that's really familiar to funders.
So so the experience of riders and the constituency and what's going on and the quality of the service that they get is really going to be directly connected to what Congress does. And that we want our Congress people to connect their votes to the experience of riders in their cities. And also that what happens in the big cities that hit the fiscal cliff sooner is going to have a ripple effect across rural America, where the supply chain and supply chain jobs are, and that people often think that the impact is going to be limited to just the big cities, but what we know is that it'll have a rolling and ripple effect that's larger than that. I mean, honestly, I think it would be great to also say that one of the things that's been, I think, good about the campaign to date is that people have been able to make the case as riders with transit unions and workers by their side, and in conjunction with their agencies, who they're often struggling with around the provision of services or improvement or the future, but have built relationship and shared common cause with them as they through this campaign. And I think that's
huge.
Opportunity for us moving forward, not just in this current fight, but for people to come together as a united front to present in the future as we move forward how transit can be a core part of a public reconstruction that we need next year. And that transit is not the only investment we need, but if we want a more just, equitable, and sustainable economy, transit has got to be one of the things that's centered in that discussion. And I think that's kind of my wrap.
I think that's really good. Does it make sense to ask you a little bit about sort of the nuts and bolts of what you do? Like what this looks like working with a bunch of transit advocates around the country, communicating what's happening and what needs to happen? I mean, is that, what's the shorthand for your work?
Yeah, since we started thinking it was a 6-week campaign, it's been a little bit build the plane as we fly it. But you know, I would say that one thing that's important to understand is that we need to do 3 things. We need to drive a narrative about transit across the country. We need to move specific votes. You know, we need to understand the dynamics of power. You know, first we started with moving what people refer to as bleed for transit Democrats to like really raise it up on the agenda. Then we went into contested Senate seats to really create some tension where there could be pressure put on the Speaker of the Senate. And then we, you know, and we need the surround sound of everybody echoing the message. And so we tried to, what we worked to do was to bring first sort of riders and grassroots groups together to act in concert to drive that narrative, to shift the relationships of power by engaging in that power analysis and acting on it. And then thirdly, I think what we've done is build that infrastructure, which is invest in the groups directly, but invest in building this larger collaboration across sectors. And that the role that I play is really in helping, since I'm not a transit expert, is really sort of drawing out on the expertise of people that have it in this field to shape that strategy and to help focus the energy of the groups coming from different sectors, coming from the grassroots, to be able to coordinate and act in a way that is effective in shifting the relationships of power and winning the policy outcome that we want to see.
Update us a little bit on what's happening with transit, and then let's segue into into the work that you're doing.
Great.
Working with.
Okay. So as hopefully many people are becoming aware, transit is hitting a fiscal cliff. And what we mean by that is that because ridership was down, then fare revenue was down, that money is running short, especially in our largest cities where there is a bigger public transit systems. And as a result of that, what we see is agencies who want to keep their staff employed at full time, who want to clean their buses and have clean and safe transit, all with the best of intentions, being forced to balance a budget and to have to make cuts. And as a result, what happens is that service is cut, and that has a ripple effect through our whole community. So as you know, even if you're not a rider of public transit, if you need to go to the hospital in this environment with the COVID virus, many of the essential workers that work in that hospital ride public transit. And as a result of cuts and shortfalls, their commute may be 2 hours longer each way because the bus isn't running as frequently. People may be having to add an expense and take a taxi or an Uber to the bus stop because they can't walk the 2 miles or have enough time to walk the 2 miles in the morning to get to the bus stop that's actually running. So as the revenue goes down and the system contracts, it really has a ripple effect on everybody. Small business districts are hurt. Shoppers can't get to them. We can't connect as a society. And we really, we want to push back and really remind people how essential our public transit systems are to our economy and to achieving the sort of economic, just, equitable, sustainable cities and communities that we envision for our future.
So tell us about your work. You're working with transit advocates on the ground, but also connecting to labor and other communities and constituencies.
Yeah. Well, yes. So first, let me give a shout out to the great organizations that organize riders, who go out and survey riders, who build their leadership, who collect their stories and connect them with the people who are making decisions that will impact their lives. So one of the essential things that are going on is the organizational development that happens, that brings the voices of people directly impacted by the decisions being made in Congress today about whether to invest in transit to the table in that discussion, making that connection happen. So let me first start with a great shout out to the work of those organizations that have been doing it much longer than I have and deserve a lot of credit. In addition, we've, a good example of the kind of work that we've been doing is those groups have been doing a lot of work in their own districts, but one of the things that we've been doing is pulling together those organizations that organize riders with labor unions, with the agencies, in some places with the people who do the supply chain, who service the businesses, that the ripple effect that of transit spending, to make the case that of why transit is important to everybody and how their destinies are interconnected, and not only for the case in the moment that we need $32 billion invested in transit to make to have the outcomes and sustain the current systems, but that we have a shared vision of how transit will be central to reconstructing the economy that we want to see in the future as we come out of this COVID virus and the pandemic.
It feels like you've built a level of trust that heretofore hasn't really existed. And in some cases, advocates have had to go up against transportation agencies. It feels like this crisis has really forged a new relationship, a new movement. Congratulations.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we have common cause, right? We want to see the same things. And I think that organizations on the ground uh, want, uh, know that they can't see the improvements they want, the expansions of the system that they are advocating for, the elevators that they want into subway stations, unless these agencies have the money they need. There's always going to be tug and pull between riders and unions and the agencies, and that can be healthy. It creates the system that we want, and it's part of the integrated democracy that we have. But it's also critical that we know when we have common cause that we come together to fight for the big picture and the investments that are critical to see that vision implemented across the country.
So what are some of the, oh, sorry, you go, Darryl.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you to quickly walk through some of the, like the strategies, like what does this look like to connect to members of Congress, to raise up transit issues to them?
It takes many forms. So some of the riders have been taking selfies and tweeting them out to their congressperson saying, I ride transit every day. I love my bus driver. Transit is important to me. Invest in my bus route. Whatever that comment is, there are people on the street that are invested in it. It could, we've done town halls where it's really a public forum where workers and riders and agencies have come to sort of share their story and put it forward to educate. Sometimes it sounds like just a budget line item, or it sounds like a policy that's far removed. And what we want to do is bring that down into the everyday experiences of real people and the events that we have and the stories that we tell. We had a big national rally that brought all the advocates from cities across and riders from cities across the country with transit agencies, with labor unions to make the case together, speak up, and to tell the story of a shared vision for transit. Those are some examples, I hope, that illustrate what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Those daily stories, I think, make the crisis real. And it's a down payment because, as we know, the Transportation Reauthorization Act is coming up. This is not just a battle that is going to end with the end of this crisis. It's an ongoing crisis that is only deepening. I was interested when you said, you really weren't working on these issues. Was it 6 weeks ago or 7 or 8 weeks ago?
Yeah.
What is, you're a lifelong organizer. What has your experience been about the people who you're working with? Like, what have you found that's surprising or not surprising?
Inspiring, actually. Like the willingness that people had to come to the table without ego, to hear about what the crisis was, and then to figure out the one-on-one conversations I had were really like, tell me about your organization. What are your assets? What's within your wheelhouse to do? How does it fit into this bigger strategy that we've articulated? And what advice do you have for all of us moving forward? So sort of matching the capacity and the inclinations and the ability and skills of people on the ground with the strategy to sort of pull out and enable people to make their best contribution. And, nobody said no. Everybody has been willing to really put their shoulder to the grindstone. It may be in different ways based on the capacity and the role that they play in this community of people fighting for public transit. We do calls about twice a month, and we have more than 60 people showing up, contributing. Now sort of putting, at first it was like, what can we do? What do we need to do? And now people are coming to the table, offering up, this is what we could do. Here, what about this? I'll lead a team of people who can, play out this strategy, who wants to join me. So really building that sense of community. And also, I think we've gained a lot of credibility with our allies, with labor unions and with the agencies themselves, who were very nervous about, joining a rally of people who sometimes are knocking on their door, highly critical of their behaviors, and have built a new trust and hopefully opened up long-term, dialogues about what we need to do together to improve our public transit systems to achieve the vision that we share.
That's great.
I realize that most of these groups are small. They are under-resourced. They're working really
Absolutely.
hard, really dedicated people. And that traditionally in the past, their focus has been mostly local, on their transit agency, on local funding, on state level funding. And now, in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of this crisis, with all the other demands, we're also asking them to engage on a federal level. To do more with, in a lot of cases, less. So you realize the fact that they are stepping up is pretty amazing and impressive, and a real testament to their dedication and commitment to this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And some groups are not staffed at all, are entirely volunteer. And those groups also, without any staff, without any help, have been at the table asking what we could do and making the contribution that they can make. And it's really one of the things that's really inspiring is the range of sizes and shapes of organizations that are invested in this.
It's a great case for philanthropy stepping up and helping to resource both the volunteers and the people with staff. We want to thank you for being on our show and joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our viewers with?
I think that my message is, invest in the grassroots. It's critical to our success. The stories and experiences of riders, of workers, connecting that to the national narrative about what's needed, and understanding that this is not just a short-term crisis, but we're going to have to reconstruct our economy, and that transit needs to play a critical and long-term role to achieve the outcomes that we'd like to see, which is a more just, equitable, and sustainable economy. So thank you so much for your time and the invitation to join you today.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great.
Okay.
So Martha, what I think is most interesting about the work that Leeann and frontline groups are doing is that it's not just work for now. It's a down payment for future challenges that are going to arise, not the least of which is the reauthorization of the Federal Transportation Act, which sometimes can last for 5 up to 10 years, depending on whether or not they reauthorize it and when they reauthorize it. So it feels like we're laying a foundation down for that purpose. And what's needed clearly is more resources going to those frontline and community-based organizations. Why don't you expand a little bit on how that will be helpful for us as funders to know more about?
Well, the reauthorization of the transportation bill that will come up sometime soon is really the chance to reset how the federal government funds transportation, and whether it will just be a minor update of, working around the edges, trying to make what's inherently a fairly bad bill slightly better, or whether there'll be more significant reform, we're not sure. But we do know that we'll need the voices of these transit advocates, mobility advocates, people who care about sustainable cities speaking up. So it's great that this network is getting energized and activated. We're also really aware that the needs are great amongst these advocacy groups. And so, as we've mentioned before, with the leadership of Daryl and other funders, we set up a mobility fund, matching fund, to help support some of these great advocates and their work on the ground. And we'll be back at the next broadcast to really do a deep dive into the grantees. We're in the final stages of awarding those grants. So we'll bring you an update on that. And we're starting to think about the next round. Daryl?
That's right. Just when we're done with one round, we're going to start the next. So if you're a funder, contact us. If you like this video, like it. If you're an advocacy group, contact us as well, because our idea, our hope is to grow the fund and grow the level of impact that community groups are having in the conversation about what should be the better, more sustainable, more equitable form of mobility. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.